critical thinking on current issues. This is Undercurrent. Hi, welcome to Undercurrent. I'm Gabe Lyons, and I'm so thankful that you're in this conversation with us, where we're thinking deeply about current issues. We're trying to go underneath the noise, trying to understand beneath the chaos, the confusion, the constant drip of information, what's really happening underneath. How do we think well? How do we stay curious? How do we advance good as Christians who care about our neighbors, who care about humanity flourishing, who believe that there is a better way, that God's given us a better way to think about the world and to operate in this world. And so in our previous episode, episode 1 is going to paint for you a picture of the current world that we're living in, a world that's driven by a vision and an ideology that sees man as machine, that sees a future where we as humans are much more like robots, where we as humans aren't people of free will that have divine purpose and meaning, but that we're people that are meant to be shaped and manipulated and even perfected in our biology so that we can perform as better human beings in a system being created for us. And so I'll walk you through that in episode 1, but that leads to this episode where we're going to talk about a future. We're going to talk about a different vision for the future, a different vision, a parallel structure, a parallel system that's going to operate in this world that I believe for Christians, it is the moment. It is the moment for us to step in to this future. Now, the ideology for this future is not about perfecting biology. The ideology is about respecting God's design. It's recognizing that God's done a beautiful work in how He designed creation, how He designed the world to function in all its forms, how He's designed human beings to form, the systems He's created in our bodies, the ways in which we're meant to operate. He's done a beautiful thing. Genesis 1:27 speaks to this. It's very simple. He says this, "So God created mankind in His own image. In the image of God, He created them. Male and female, He created them." It sounds so simple, but when you recognize and believe that that is true, then you recognize that every child that's being formed, every new birth that takes place in our world, is actually a beautiful sign of divinity. It's a beautiful sign of God interacting with humankind to say, I want to create life. I want to put something beautiful into the world, someone who has a soul, who's a human being, that has all the signs of my image baked into who they are. And when we as humans start to manipulate that, when we start to mess with that, when we start to think we have a better way to perfect children, biology, designer genes, genetics, eugenics, all of these ideologies start to come into play. And they start to put human beings and man in the place of God. And instead of trusting God's perfect design, we start to manipulate. We start to think we know what's better. That type of hubris, that type of pride always leads to death, always leads to disaster. And so our ideology is about that. Now, the emotion that this future operates in is one of hope. Now, the man as machine vision of life was about fear. It's about manipulation. But in this vision, it is about hope. It's about us being people that bring hope to life, that we give people a vision of a future that's better, a vision of the future that's redeemed, that takes things that are broken and we work to be a part of what God's trying to do to restore things back to their original design, to their original form. We take this on in our work and our vocations and the way we raise our children and the types of communities we create and the types of cultural artifacts that we create and we produce in the world, and the way in which we treat our brothers and sisters, the way in which we see the image of God in the other person. We don't want to make everyone conform to our image. We believe that people are best when they're conformed to God's image, and that He's given them this intrinsic desire to pursue that kind of a life. But many times, they don't know how. They've never been awakened to this reality. They haven't been shown the truth of the gospel, the good news of the kingdom, that there's a better way to live as a human being, and there's a way that blesses other people, that leads to a life of purpose and mission and flourishing. Well, in that future, we as people of hope, in the midst of a dark world, in the midst of a world where there's so much anxiety, there's so many people struggling with loneliness, there's so much fear that's coming at us day in and day out through our news feeds and social media and conversations we're having with friends, that you can see in the chaos of the mind that what's needed is hope. It's hope in a future with God. Because as we know, anxiety is that future without God, and we as Christians cannot live as people of fear. We have to be people that are moving forward with wisdom, who recognize that there are dangerous things around us, but that God can give us biblical wisdom to know how to navigate those things. And then finally, the structure. The structure isn't one of coercive control as we see in the man as machine vision. the structure is a parallel structure. It's a parallel community. It's a parallel way of operating within this world. It's what Christ talked about. He talked about the kingdom of God. This is what he comes to give, is the good news of the kingdom of God. There's a different way to operate. That we as human beings, when we operate in this way, we start to bring life into every single equation that we're in. We stare death and fear in the eye. And we look at it without any concern, without any fear, because we know it's been overcome. And we know that we've been given a better way to live, and then to invite everyone else we know into it. Well, I take great inspiration from some leaders who've gone before us who really developed this idea of a parallel polis. Václav Benda was a Christian and a mathematician who lived in Czechoslovakia during a time where communism was moving in, and he believed that the way in which to create revolution wasn't necessarily protest, it was to build a parallel society. Now, a simple way of referring to that, I love how the Academy of Ideas talks about it. They describe it this way. Benda coined the phrase parallel society to refer to all social, cultural, and economic structures that existed unconstrained by the state. He called such structures parallel structures, and at the height of political oppression in the early 1970s, Benda urged Czech citizens to begin creating parallel forms of education and science and scholarship. Parallel political structures, a parallel information network, and free parallel markets that form a parallel economy. Lots of use of the word parallel, but you start to get the vision that in the midst of this kind of control, there needed to be places that were creating space for creativity, for information, for truth to be exchanged that would not be censored, where people could operate and start to find their own ways of relating to one another that lived a bit outside of this system that was being thrust upon them. Now, the definition of a parallel structure is this: a community that operates independent of state authority and creates economic, social, creative, educational, and spiritual value for themselves and all who wish to partake in an alternative culture. You see, creating a parallel structure isn't just about, hey, we as Christians should run to the hills, create our own structure, protect, defend. It's actually about creating a structure that allows people who aren't part of the body of Christ to go, wow, I can imagine a different way to live and be a human in this world, because you've created something physical, something I can participate in. I think of our churches as one of those examples, and I'll talk more about that in a minute, where the church actually becomes this incredible, tangible outpost and a signpost of the kingdom that people can bump into the gospel. They bump into it by experiencing life with us in so many different ways. I want to read to you a quote out of The Power of the Powerless by Václav Benda. And here's what he says. What else are parallel structures than an area where a different life can be lived? A life that is in harmony with its own aims and which in turn structures itself in harmony with those aims. What else are those initial attempts at social self-organization than the efforts of a certain part of society to rid itself of the self-sustaining aspects of totalitarianism, and thus to extricate itself radically from its involvement in the totalitarian system? You see, what he's pushing back on is totalitarianism. It's this idea of control. It's new structures coming in to replace history, to replace tradition, to replace existing ways in which we operate and think and believe with a new ideology. That's totalitarianism. So in the midst of that, what he's promoting, this was 50 years ago, was that we need to create a different way to operate, different structures. That's the way that you press on and push back against totalitarianism. So I want to share with you 3 ways that I believe we can create parallel institutions. What do those look like? How do we do it? You see, the church is designed to be a parallel structure. It always has been since the beginning. Since you look at the book of Acts and you look throughout the New Testament, you see that Paul was establishing a new type of church, a new way to treat one another, a new way to live with one another, a new way to operate in a world that had completely different ideologies. But to be faithful meant you were going to have to do that in a household of faith. We were going to have to do that operating under rules that the divine King has given to us, not just our government. And so as the church thinks about its future in this moment, we have one of those great opportunities. So many people have left the church. You look back over the last few years, and there's been a bit of a settling out. Those who looked at church as just a cultural way to connect or for fellowship or as a feel-good moment to boost their sense of morality, they've left. And so what we're left with is the faithful, and we're left with those who are seeking after truth and are looking for better answers than the world could ever give. And so it's in that moment that you exist as the church, whether you're a leader in the church, a volunteer, or just participating, or perhaps you're leading a small group or you're leading a conversation with those that you've been put in leadership of or to steward their care, whether it's your team, your employees, your colleagues. Wherever you are, you're this outpost of the kingdom. You're representing a parallel way of seeing the world, a different vision of the future. I think of the scripture in 1 Thessalonians 4:10-12 that says this, "But we urge you, brothers, to excel more and more and to aspire to live quietly, to attend to your own matters, and to work with your own hands, as we instructed you. Then you will behave properly toward outsiders without being dependent on anyone." Look at that phrase, without being dependent on anyone. You know, how much do we think about this idea of sustainability? Am I dependent? Who am I dependent on? Well, I'm dependent on a lot of things to live my life. I'm dependent on a grocery store. I'm dependent on gas stations. I'm dependent on roads. I'm dependent on vehicles. I'm dependent on manufacturing. I'm dependent on supply chains. I'm dependent on a government that's here to have protection against crime, and on and on and on. We are living very dependent lives. We've kind of grown accustomed to dependence. And in a totalitarian world, more dependence is desired. You see, the ideology is driven to say, you should depend on your government. You should depend on our education department. You should depend on our health structure. You should depend on everything we're providing because we know best and we can protect you. And that's the ideology that's always pushed forward. That starts to create a comfortability because it's more convenient. It requires less effort, quite honestly. And yet we see here in 1 Thessalonians 4:12, don't be dependent on anyone. You see, Paul's almost giving this prophetic vision to the church that says, look, operate in a way that is sustainable. Operate in a way that you don't have to need things from other people. Work with your hands. Create your own things. I think of farms. I think of gardening. I think of all these things. Create your own, not because there aren't other ways to get healthy food, but perhaps it's meant to do something for us, for our human dignity, that we start to recognize, man, God has designed human beings amazingly resourceful, with all kinds of abilities, but are we teaching our children these things? Did we grow up learning these things? I think we'll find that we've lost some of that. We haven't grown up understanding some of the ways to be less dependent on other people for the things in which God's given us a great opportunity to cultivate ourselves. But for us to build these institutions, I think there's three ways to think about it. We have to go from global to local. You see, most of us have been trained up in a world that really valued and celebrated globalism. It was the ability for us to operate in a way that our neighbors in China all of a sudden were providing all the resources that we might need in America to operate, and vice versa. We started to break down the walls, and there were so many good things about that. But the systems that have been put into place has caused us to be really dependent on people that we don't know if we can always rely on them, whether they're reliable partners and people that are continue to provide the needs that we might have. You see, we have to think more locally. We have to think about our communities locally. We have to think about the ways in which we're creating sustainable, resilient communities that can stand in the midst of challenges, chaos, lack. How do we provide for one another? I'm reminded of Jeremiah 29:5-7, where it's described this way. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat their produce. Take wives and have sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Multiply there. Do not decrease. Seek the prosperity of the city to which I have sent you as exiles. Pray to the Lord on its behalf, for if it prospers, you too will prosper. You see this amazing vision of these exiles in Babylon living under complete empire. I mean, you talk about totalitarianism. They're under complete control, no freedom. And what they're being asked to do is in the midst of that, to plant their own gardens, to not be dependent on anyone. Does that sound similar? To create space where they're in fellowship with one another. They're creating families. They're growing their population. It takes us back to Genesis, where we're called to multiply. The same commandments given here. Continue to multiply. Continue to have a hopeful vision of the future where you're growing and your family's growing and you're flourishing. You see, that was a vision for hope for the people who are in exile, and a similar vision that we must have. When we think about going from global to local, think about who are the people in your community that are trustworthy, that you can depend on, where you can actually build a community that's dependent on one another, not the government. Think about who in your local community is a part of that trusted circle, those people that you can trust, that you can start to rely on for different needs that might come up and that might be necessary. So that's the first way we have to think about the parallel. We don't just think globally. We do need to reinvigorate our thinking around the local. There are so many ways that I'm seeing leaders think locally. I think of Eddie Bedrina, who's creating sustainable greenhouses and these amazing projects that are creating new fresh food systems for people. I think of our church, Church of the City in Franklin, Tennessee, that's working to cultivate gardens, that's literally plowing the land next to the parking lot, this beautiful green lawn that's been manicured and perfect for so many years, and made a decision that we're going to start to till that. We're going to start to plant gardens. We're going to start to create produce and food for people in our community who have need, who maybe can't afford what's taking place because of inflation, or who live in food deserts around our community. We're going to be those who do that. I think of our friend Matt Whitlock out at Capo Beach Church, who created a new private school in the midst of COVID during what was taking place in California, where kids weren't able to go to school. And so what they said is, we're going to create a parallel structure. We're going to create a school. I think of Suzanne Phillips, who does a similar thing in Atlanta, Georgia, helping others, inspiring others to create their own schools, micro schools, and ways in which parents can take back the building of their own parallel structures that aren't going to just be reliant on what's being told to them by the government or our education department, but says, no, we're going to train up our children in the way they should go. And so they do that. They take responsibility for it. I think of places that are doing medical sharing, for example, that are competing even with current ways people do insurance. Places like Medishare, who actually offer a community of people a way to handle healthcare in a new way that's different than how the system has been created for us. And so there's much vision for a lot of these organizations, these entities, these ways people are thinking about food, thinking about medicine, thinking about education. I would submit that in a perfect parallel structure, that every church would be thinking through those three issues: education, medical, how are we handling food? How are we thinking about parallel structures that allow us to not be dependent on anyone, but allow us to function here and to provide life for those who are seeking it? Then the second way we must think in the parallel structure is moving from biotechnology to human. You see, we must move away from just thinking about how to perfect biology. We must understand what it's going to be human. I think of Dr. Aaron Kheriaty, a bioethicist, who writes this. He says, "The real division today is no longer left and right, liberal or conservative, or Democrat, Republican. It is between those who will accept a technocratic biosecurity surveillance regime and those who will resist." But we're going to be forced to answer some big questions about how much are we going to let technology intersect with our biology? Where is the line going to be for you? What is that line? Is it allowing new mRNA technology to be a part of your body? Is it going to be allowing doctors that have a vision for a future child that you may want to have put their opinions in place as to how you should design that child? We'll have a future episode coming up on designer humans and what is happening in that space. Well, that's exactly where this biotech merges with humanity. It's also been the seedbed for visions of eugenics, where there have been those in power that C.S. Lewis spoke about in Abolition of Man, who decided they had a better vision for human beings, a better vision for the future of humanity, and they were going to start to create human beings in their own image, and they were going to eliminate those that they didn't believe were worthy of life. We have to be warned. We have to be careful about that future. And then finally, we have to go from Babylonian thinking to biblical. You see, we've grown up, many of us, in empire-type thinking, especially in America or other Western countries, where we've just come to trust governments. We've come to believe that they always have our best interests in mind. We've come to operate with total dependence on the systems that they've created. But I think we're going into a new season where we're going to have to operate off of a different framework, a biblical framework. We're going to have to be reminded of what are the rules for how you live a flourishing life. How do the 10 Commandments actually speak to that? How do I know what is moral and immoral? How do I understand what's evil and being driven by a satanic ideology versus what's being driven by Christ ideology? You see, we're going to move into a season where it's going to require all of us working together, thinking together, reading together, discerning together, asking tough questions, asking better questions of ourselves about how do we build this parallel? How do we build a parallel structure, a parallel way of operating that invites others in, that allows others to see a vision for their life, for themselves, for their children, that brings life versus death? And so my challenge is, as we move through conversations on Undercurrent, we're going to speak to some of these tensions and also what is it going to mean to build these parallel structures. You're going to hear from experts. You're going to hear from people who have done it, who are doing it, who've learned certain things about these practices that bring us back to who we were meant to be. It's an exciting vision. It's a beautiful vision. It's one that you can start to see humanity starting to move towards. We're seeing a movement towards homesteading and people saying, I want to get a little piece of land. I want to raise my kids in a way that allows them to get outside and get their hands dirty again and start to work the land and go back to some of these basic, more primitive ideas that maybe we discarded over the last century because industrialism and the Industrial Revolution and the advance of technology was very captivating. But I think many are waking up to some of the pitfalls of that life, of the way in which it leads us maybe to be less human, maybe to not be able to function fully in the way we've been designed to be. And so the question is for the church and for any Christian, how are you going to create conversations around parallel ideas? Ideas that might confront current ideologies, but that offer people hope. We'll be doing something that's not just for this moment, but that's actually for a future vision. It might be for your children, and it might be for a future generation. But like Václav Benda says, there's a fundamental difference between the natural resistance of life to totalitarianism and the deliberate expansion of space in which the parallel policy can exist. The former is a cluster of flowers that has grown in place accidentally sheltered from the killing winds of totalitarianism and easily destroyed when those winds change direction. But the latter, the parallel policy, is a trench whose elimination depends strictly on a calculated move by the state power to destroy it. What he's saying there is when you build parallel structures, you're actually building something so strong. It's stronger than the facade that's put up by totalitarianism. It's actually a building of resilience and a building of strength that to be taken out will take direct action from the government. It will take direct action from forces that seek to eliminate, but it's very difficult to be done. And as we see in this story play out throughout history of the Czech Revolution, it was this parallel society operating over years and years that created a life, that created a joy, that created a way of operating and resilience that over time ended up taking over the empire. They ended up winning the day. They ended up destroying totalitarianism and communism, and they ended up creating a life of freedom for the Czech citizens. And so it's out of a story of inspiration like that I draw from, that I want to say to you, let's be a part of building the parallel structure. Let's do that together. Let's do that wherever you've been called, whatever you've been doing. Let's think in a way that's not about a future as man as machine, but we are people who are made in God's image, man as a divine creation that's here and meant to live out a purpose that's distinct, that's beautiful, that's unique, and that God's given us when he created us in his image. And that we're going to do that best when we do it together, when we encourage all kinds of creativity to spring up all over this country, all over the world, that gives people a vision of hope for a future that they're not seeing right now. But I think they could if we would step into that space and advance good. Well, I'm so glad you've decided to listen to Undercurrent and begin to share this with other people who, you know, might be interested in these kinds of conversations. I know we're taking a big look, we're taking a high view, a macro view of where we sit. But as we move forward, these next episodes, the next one is going to deal with a letter I wrote to Christian leaders, and that's all of us. It's not just meant for those that hold positions in Christian leadership, but it's any Christian who's really thinking about the times and trying to understand how do we lead right now and what do we do. And then episode 4 is going to move into polarization and who do we trust and how do we think well about that. And then the final one will be technocracy for season 1, episode 5. You will not want to miss that because I'm going to help lay out for us how technology has started to move in to start to bring more control and surveillance. And some of the areas I'll talk about in our next episode, it'll get a lot more practical. So thank you for being a part of it. If you want to watch this episode, you can go to GabeLyons.com/undercurrent and you can view it there.